Global jihadism is the biggest threat for the security of Canada. Canadian government has taken multiple measures to secure the security and integrity of Canadians and Canadian borders. Current biometric screening has proven to be a reliable and cost-effective measure for both the Canadian immigration officials as well as Canadian border officials in order to identify the people who are entering the Canadian borders. Recently, Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced the expanding nature of biometric measures at its borders, and we are very honored to have Minister of Citizenship and Immigration today with us, Chris Alexander, to talk about this expanding nature of the biometric measures at Canadian borders. Welcome to TAG TV at Political Dilemmas with us today.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So, Minister, as you know that jihadism is an expanding threat to not only Canada, to the entire globe, and Canada has taken a lot of measures to protect the security of Canadians. What is the significance of these biometric measures?
Well, first, it's a very important measure because it actually prevents people from stealing other identities, from pretending to be someone else, from deceiving us about who they really are. And that's why many other countries, dozens, have already implemented these measures. Canada has them in place already for 30 countries and territories whose nationals are required to provide biometrics. And what do we mean by biometrics? It's simply a digital photograph and fingerprints. We require now the nationals of 30 countries and territories to provide them. We will provide for 94 others. We will require 94 others, other countries' nationals to provide them. And how do we use them? We require them at the time of the application for the visa. We check them against Canadian databases. We will give every protection to the privacy of that information. And we will simply use it to prevent criminals, people who've abused Canada's generosity in the past, or indeed terrorists or members of organized crime groups from arriving in this country. And what does it do? It protects legitimate travelers, those who have legitimate business here. We see the numbers of travelers coming from every part of the world growing by huge percentages every year. And we want to protect the legitimate travelers from the threat posed by this small group of jihadi terrorists or others who represent threats. We are taking these measures on the basis of, on a firm foundation of a very modern system that is very generous. We already have visa exemptions for the largest number of countries in the world, over 60 countries and territories. And we are providing better service. We were providing more and more visitors with 10-year multiple entry visas. But when we do that, when we are generous, as Canada has always been generous, we need to also protect ourselves, and we do that with biometrics to make sure that very small group who would like to pretend to be a legitimate traveler but in fact have a violent agenda or a criminal agenda are not able to get here.
I like the point that the biometric measures are protecting the legitimate travelers. So what kind of travelers will have to go through the biometric screening?
Well, as I say, it's everyone who needs a visa to come to Canada. Let's say there are 200 plus countries in the world and territories, most of them independent states. Dozens of them don't need a visa to come to Canada, and so they won't need to provide biometrics. 30 of them already need to provide biometrics. So we're talking about just under 100 more countries whose nationals will need to provide these biometrics. But as I say, those who travel to Canada often, those who are applying for their second visa because they've been here once, they are generally in countries like India, China, Brazil, Mexico, getting 10-year multiple entry visas. So the biometrics and the visa will apply for 10 years in the vast majority of cases, giving Canadians and giving legitimate travelers that that assurance that the person sitting next to them, the person we meet at the border, is actually who they claim to be and doesn't have an agenda that's going to result in terrorism or some other serious crime.
So the persons who are arriving at the border, what kind of processing they have to go through the biometric measures at the borders when they're entering Canada, and these personnel are on the visa?
Sure. Well, first, when they get the biometrics, they will go to the same point of service, one of roughly 180 around the world, where we accept visitor visa applications. So it's one-stop shopping, both for the visa and for the biometrics. Once they have those, they get on a plane, they travel to Canada, they come to the border, they provide their fingerprints in an automated way, and they show us their passport to prove who they actually are. The passport, of course, has the photograph in it. So the biometrics are used to make sure that that person claiming to be XYZ is actually who they say they are. And we, again, check it against databases, criminal and otherwise, that we have in Canada. And only when there is a concern, when we think there is reason to suspect a terrorist link or a criminal link, would we go to our friends and allies to see whether that concern is actually well-founded. But every step of the way, we are protecting privacy. We are not in the business of victimizing innocent people. We're good at zeroing in on the real threats. Our law enforcement and our security agencies have a lot of experience in this. And indeed, it's to protect the millions of people, tens of millions of people, who visit Canada for absolutely in good faith every year.
So that's a very good answer you gave, that it is not interfering with the privacy of Canadian citizens.
No, and we've worked every step of the way with the Privacy Commissioner at the federal level. Because Canada has some of the most, perhaps the most robust privacy laws in the world. We're proud of that. We're proud of the fact that we protect every individual's information from abuse in government or in outside of government. And we want to jealously guard that reputation, because we know it too is valuable, just as the safety and security of Canada, the fact that we have the rule of law and a low crime rate here, are assets for all Canadians. Everything we're doing is to ensure that that remains the case, and that, as you say, this very large-scale threat of violent jihadi terrorism, which we see concentrated now in Iraq and Syria, but with a serious presence in at least a dozen other countries, is not able to launch attacks, to bring violence to our shores here in Canada. Every country has a responsibility to be vigilant about terrorism. Canada is no exception, particularly because of the global connections that we have. Thanks to our immigration, thanks to our diversity, thanks to our well-developed trading relationships with every part of the world, we need to make sure that legitimate trade, that legitimate travel is safe from terrorism and indeed from criminality.
So taking from there, going forward, how effective are these biometric measures against deported and those who have denied entry into Canada?
Yeah, they're going to work very well on that front, in that one of the components of the database against which we will compare this biometric information that we receive, and we already do it, as I say, for 30 countries and territories, is the record of those who've been deported or who have come to Canada and gotten into trouble, fallen out of status, committed crimes, or other abuses while here. We need to know whether those people are coming back. You know the story, as well as I do, of some of these violent offenders convicted of crimes in Canada, deported to their countries of origin, who then have come back here, sometimes multiple times. We brought in the Fast Removal of Foreign Criminals Act to address this issue. We've seen dozens of really hardened criminals removed from Canada, but some of them have been here 3 or 4 times under different identities because they can buy a forged passport or steal the identity of someone else. With the kind of biometric regime we're talking about now, that will no longer be possible. And this is a substantial investment. This is $315 million or so that will be spent over 5 years. The system won't be fully functional for all of these countries until 2018-19. But as I say, it's already in place for 30 countries. And it is a best practice that many other countries are pursuing.
Going back to sharing information and privacy concerns, how many countries the biometric system has been sharing the information?
Well, we share information when there is a national security or a terrorist concern or an organized crime concern very actively with our closest allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand. We're also in a position to share with a larger group of allies when there's a connection between someone suspected of of having committed crimes or having been active in a terrorist organization with larger groups of countries. Obviously, we only do that on the basis of bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements with other democracies that have the rule of law. And we do it on the basis of a very firm principle that the privacy of the information must be protected every step of the way. A national security investigation is governed by our laws, our criminal justice system, and privacy is a big part of that in Canada.
So when do you think these biometric measures and system is going to be in effect?
It'll be fully in place by 2018-19.
Okay. And
so by the spring of 2019, it will be fully in place.
As well as the main question, which our viewers would be interested who are watching TAC TV today, is are these the very good measures to protect the integrity and Canadians of citizens?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of a series of measures that we're taking. First, we want Canada to be connected to the world. We're pursuing free trade across the Pacific. We have signed a deal with Europe. We've signed a deal with Korea. We've signed deals with many countries in Latin America. We want Canadians to go to these partner countries, grow our investments, grow our exports, and nationals of those countries to come here. That's why we're giving better service, 10-year multiple entry visas, faster service, online service, and we will have the electronic travel authorization next year that will allow us to lift the visa requirement for even more countries. In our time in office, we have already lifted the visa requirement for 11 countries, in addition to the ones that were visa exempt in 2006. We are the country in the world that has the most visa exempt partners. But alongside that, we need to keep ourselves safe. Biometrics help us ensure who is who. We're also taking steps to make sure Canadians don't travel abroad to take part in terrorism. We're canceling and sometimes revoking the passports of Canadians who've said clearly that they intend to go abroad to join ISIS or other terrorist groups. Bill C-51 allows us to share information among government agencies about potential suspected terrorists. That wasn't happening nearly enough until now. And we will revoke the citizenship of dual nationals convicted of terrorism. It doesn't happen very often in Canada. We are one of the few countries that is mostly not seen as a source of terrorism or international terrorists. But as you know very well, we have seen Canadians travel, as we've seen people travel from around the world to join ISIS in Syria and Iraq. We have seen terrorism here at home last October in our own parliament and in different forms in recent decades. We want to send a very clear message that being a Canadian citizen is incompatible with being a terrorist, being a member of any of the groups that we list as terrorist groups, whether they are European separatist movements that use violence, or the Taliban in Afghanistan, or Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Jabal al-Nusra, the list goes on. As a Canadian citizen, you really shouldn't be helping these groups, recruiting for them. Those are all crimes in this country. And those convicted of terrorism in a Canadian court who are dual nationals will lose their citizenship. We can't revoke the citizenship of people who have only one nationality, because we're not going to make people stateless. We have an obligation not to do so. But we take terrorism very seriously, and we don't want our citizens to be part of it.
So, Minister, you're totally right that these biometric systems will tell who is who, and previously the present biometric systems have been able to identify denied refugee claimants, deportees, and known criminals. So, any last message you want to give to our viewers of TAC TV concerning biometric measures?
Sure. Well, the first message, I think, is the simple one. We are determined, this Conservative government is determined to do the things that we need to do to keep Canada safe. Terrorism today in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere is a big threat. You know, I was in Afghanistan for 6 years. I saw the ravages of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. What we see today, unfortunately, is on a much larger scale. And it's led to the death of hundreds of thousands, the displacement of tens of millions. And we've seen terrorist attacks in dozens of countries just over the past year, including in Canada. So we can't take this, we can't be casual about this, we can't be cavalier about it, we can't sit on the sidelines, we can't pretend these issues aren't there. Violent jihadi terrorism has targeted Canada by name, and we have to respond by being true to our tradition of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We cannot have our prosperity, we cannot have our justice system, we cannot have the standard of living that we enjoy here unless we keep Canada safe. And that's what biometrics will help us do, together with a range of other measures that this government has been prepared to undertake. I have to say, Sarah, the opposition voted against these measures, against the spending on biometrics. They voted against most of the measures with which I've been associated to ensure that Canadians don't travel abroad to take part in terrorism, to revoke the citizenship of convicted terrorists who are dual nationals. We are a government under Prime Minister Stephen Harper that is prepared to do these things because the situation in the world today requires us to do it. And if we don't do it, we really are putting ourselves at risk, because our friends and allies are doing these things. They are making themselves safe with new legislation and new measures. Some of it goes much further than what we've done. We want to do everything under the rule of law. We want to do everything in conformity with Canada's privacy laws. We're doing these things to protect our freedoms in Canada, not to reduce them. And it is the jihadi terrorists, and sometimes organized crime groups as well, that are the threat to our freedoms. We have to keep those threats, to the extent we can, outside of Canada, and prevent Canadians from going off to do the wrong thing and put themselves at risk by joining terrorist groups in Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere.
Awesome, great. So Canada is a piece of heaven. Canadian citizenship is not a right, it is a privilege. To protect Canadians from the impending nature of terrorism, Biometric Measures is a step towards an enhanced protection and security of Canada. Thank you very much, Minister Chris Alexander, for being here with us at TAC TV at my show, Political Dilemmas. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Sarah. Thank you.
Biometrics made a mainstream splash by the introduction of iPhone 5S, which featured a Touch ID, and the person's finger was used to unlock the phone. But similar technology was used when Sony introduced a thumb drive with a fingerprint scanner. Similarly, fingerprinting is used at theme parks in the US, in Disney World, SeaWorld, and a lot more others. So when coming to Canada and biometric security, biometrics is not a new thing. Biometrics is there to protect the integrity and security of our home, our country, our Canada. Thank you very much, and thank you for watching Political Dilemmas here with Sarah Bokhari at TAC TV.